1949, when Melbourne won the right to host the 1956 Olympic Games, three-day eventing as a sport did not exist in Australia. However, a small group of men, led by Sam Horden, then President of the New South Wales Agricultural Society, saw an opportunity to launch Australia onto the World Equestrian stage. Within a few short years, Australia was to win Olympic gold, and eventing would become one of Australia's most successful Olympic disciplines. From Australia's Olympic debut in 1956 to the Rio Games in 2016, Australia's eventers have collected 6 gold, 3 silver and 3 bronze medals in team and individual competitions. This is the story of how it all started. In 1955, 6 horsemen with only polo, rough riding or working horse skills were selected to travel to England to train for the 1956 Olympic Games equestrian events that were, due to Australia's strict quarantine laws, to be held in Stockholm. Bert Jacobs was chosen to represent Australia in show jumping, whilst Bunty Thompson, Brian Crago, Ernie Baker, David Wood and John Winchester were chosen for eventing, a sport that none of them had ever competed in.
They selected the riders who had been fairly formidable in a variety of events and at the shows and at whatever was going on, and we were basically very good all-round riders, but a jack of all trades, but masters of none. But we didn't know anything about the FEI jumping and the eventing and the dressage. Dressage was completely new. We used to think it was all rather stupid. But then, of course, when we went away, we realised, God, we've got to do this and we've got to learn it and how wonderful it is. So it was eventually decided that 6 horses would go on board a cargo ship. And we had stables built on this ship and a very small exercising arena on the ship. Gwenstead was asked to go on board the ship as the groom and to take charge of the ship, of the horses entirely. The riders did not travel with the horses. And she used to lead the horses, or was supposed to lead the horses, into this exercising ring, where they would be perhaps lunched or whatever you could do in those days in the room available. 2 days out from the seas got too big, and Gwen was frightened to take them out of the boxes in case they went overboard. There wasn't much space to walk the horses round on. And so when the storms were over, which took about 5 days, she was then too frightened to take the horses out because she thought, oh, they'll be full of beans and might get hurt and go overboard. So those poor horses were kept in their box for all the time, from almost a bit over 6 weeks, and they never got out.
With their horses too weak to ride after their 3-month confinement, they had to be exercised in hand for 3 months in the English winter to build their strength, while the riders could only attend events and observe the standard of riding they would have to compete against.
Our first experience really was having a look at what was happening in England, see how good they were. I felt a bit embarrassed because I thought we will never catch up to this. They were all beautifully turned out and all beautifully mounted, and oh heavens, it just was so different to our stock saddles and all our rough stuff in Australia.
It was the task of Franz Maringa, a former instructor of the Spanish Riding School of Vienna, to transform the Australian stockmen into world-class event riders.
Well, now, Franz was a stranger to us. He was, as a man, very hard to follow. We used to laugh at him a bit. I might add now that he turned into being the most wonderful person that you could ever know and the most wonderful horseman. But we were a bit too dumb to really appreciate that. And when we were on the ship, we all went on a passenger ship. Franz used to get us up very early, and I used to think, oh, well, why can't we sleep in? We've got nothing to do. So he would take us up on the top deck and make us do gymnastic exercises, and we'd wonder why the hell we're doing this. And he made us realise how we had to use our body when we rode correctly, and how we had to understand our body, and how we had to be so fit. And we did this every day for the 6 weeks we were on the ship. Then after that, he would give us a lecture, and the lectures would be on people like Xenophon, who meant nothing to us, we'd never heard of before. We used to think, what nonsense are we going to get tomorrow? and it all sank in eventually. And of course, when we got to England, we were so relieved that we did know a bit about how to use our bodies and how all this form of riding started and how wonderful it was. And it really woke us up.
With the Australians' horses not up to task, it was decided that they would also need to purchase new mounts.
And eventually we got a great team of horses together. We ended up riding at the Games all English horses. Mine was an Irish horse called Brown Sugar that we'd bought in Ireland. Brian's was a lovely mare called Radar, who had actually done a lot of eventing in England. And the other one was Dandy, who was an old horse, but he had been the reserve horse for the 1952 British team.
With just 18 months to train for the Olympics, the Australian riders also needed to qualify. They would have just 2 opportunities to compete at a 3-day event prior to the Stockholm Games, badminton and Burghley, or so they thought.
And we were all prepared. We were good enough to compete at Burghley, which shows how quickly we really had learned what to do. But the influenza horse epidemic had hit England. And we got to Burghley and our horses started coughing. And we couldn't compete. That only left one 3-day event. And that was the huge event at badminton, which was actually not just a 3-day event, it was a qualifier for the Olympic Games. And there were all the top riders from England and Ireland, all competing, hoping to get a place, and then they would be selected for the Games. It was the selection opportunity. If we weren't good enough, we weren't going to be able to we weren't going to be entered for Stockholm. And fortunately, we did very well.
Surpassing all expectations, the Australians did remarkably well. Laurie Morgan, who would go on to represent Australia in Rome, finished an impressive 3rd, with Brian placing 9th, Bunty 11th, Ernie 13th and David 18th. Successfully taking on some of the world's best, and now qualified, Bunty, Brian and Ernie were chosen as the lineup to represent Australia as its first ever Olympic eventing team.
We flew our horses from Heathrow to Stockholm, and our horses had not actually ever flown before, so that was a bit terrifying for us. And the planes were pretty primitive. The horses were loaded up a ramp and walked up the front into the centre of the plane, and they were put in very tiny squashed boxes. It was like being in a hold of a ship. They couldn't see what was happening or what was going on. And we flew in style in a luxurious passenger plane and arrived there about the same time as our horses. And our horses did arrive safely. We were scared stiff what would happen. And so we arrived in Stockholm. Now, Stockholm itself was made out entirely for horses. The whole thing was horses. The stadium was magnificent. The conditions were magnificent. And everything was great. I can't speak too highly of Stockholm. But when we went round the course, I think we were a bit scared. It was huge. It was a galloping course. The fences were absolutely solid. You couldn't undo them if you had an accident. We thought they were highly dangerous. Anyway, we got our spirits up and decided we had to get round for the sake of Australia, and we did. Well, my dressage warm-up was just fantastic. Franz had said, Bunty, you're not to go through your test before you go in the arena. And I thought, oh, blow old France, he doesn't know, I'll get lost if I don't rehearse it out here now. And I did it with Brown Sugar. We had a lovely arena, and he did a fabulous test. And I went into the main arena about a quarter of an hour afterwards, very cock-a-hoop, thinking, now this is going to be magnificent. And Brown Sugar really said, now, Bunty, I've just done the best test of my life, and I'm not going to, you can't do another one. And he didn't do another one. And my score was pretty horrific. And I was so disappointed. I went in just cock-a-hoop thinking, oh, I'll show them.
After dressage, Australia was lying in 11th position.
And that night it poured with rain. And we wondered what on earth was going to happen in the morning. And so the course was a little more dangerous than it had already looked. So that was a bit scary. But we thought, oh, we can do nothing about it. If they're going to have it, we'll just get out and do our best. And which we did. And there was a terrible jump, number 22, I think it was. The horses were going into this fence, slipping down the gully and getting caught on the take-off side of the jump that was in the middle, where you had to go over to get to the other side. There had already been a number of accidents. I galloped straight down onto this fence, and there were, I think, 2 or 3 horses already in the ditch. And you didn't see this until you got to the edge of what was in front. And anyway, I had a very brave horse. And I remember saying to Sugar, come on, Sugar, if you can, and I'll shut my eyes. And he did. He jumped the whole lot.
Bunty and Brian posted 2 clear rounds, whilst Ernie, after 2 falls, still managed to keep the team alive by remounting and finishing the course. A team with no prior eventing experience was to finish the Games in a remarkable 4th place, agonisingly close to a bronze medal, and laying the foundations for the future of Australian eventing.
That initial team, that 56 team, extraordinary what they did. They were able to get together, have a team go to Europe, compete at a high level, come back and inspire a whole generation of new people to do that. Mind you, by the time the 60 Games came round, we had evolved quite a lot through the Sydney 3-day event.
In 1957, the Sydney 3-day event was born, becoming an Olympic qualifying event in 1959. As the sport became more formally established in Australia, many believed a medal in Rome was a real possibility. Wayne Roycroft's father, Bill, was in the team. Wayne himself would go on to win 2 Olympic medals.
Yes, well, the Rome exercise for the whole team was amazing because they were loaded onto a ship in Sydney and set it off for England. And with friends, and Laurie Morgan was the captain, Dad, Neale Lavis and Brian Crago and John Kelly. And they were able to build a small round yard on the ship where they worked the horses. So the horses weren't fit, but they were in a great position to start their fitness.
The first major test would once again be badminton.
So we were there 3 months, and we'd only competed in, I think, 1, maybe 2 one-day events, and then we went into the 3-day event at badminton, which is a pretty difficult course.
So Bill went on and actually won badminton, which was a big deal, and I think they filled the first few placings. So riding was pretty well on the board for Rome, but I think no one recognised that what they were going to do, because in those days the riders used to go out just to survive the cross country, and our people on their thoroughbreds were able to go for, well, in those days it's maximum bonus points, which is the equivalent of no penalties.
Despite the British press reporting that the Australians had got lucky at badminton, it was clear that the combination of Australian thoroughbreds and their uncompromising riders could not be underestimated.
We were always a team that were competing against one another rather than the whole world, because that was the competition that we had all along.
And Morgan was a very, very strict captain of that team. And so I would give him a lot of credit for keeping those guys together, because Bill and Morgan were like oil and water as well, even though they came up exactly through the same sort of circumstances as young people. but they clashed a little bit. Laurie's fuse was about 6 inches shorter than Dad's.
After some final show jumping and dressage preparation in England, the team and horses were flown to Rome. Unlike at the equestrian-only Stockholm event, the riders had the full Olympic experience, including marching in the opening ceremony. The final combinations chosen were Laurie Morgan on Salad Days, Neale Lavis on Mirrabooka, Bill Roycroft on Our Solo, and Brian Kago on Sabre. A solid performance in the dressage left Australia within striking distance of the lead. The next morning, they were faced with a challenging cross-country course.
I can give you an idea of how difficult the course was because there were 78 horses competed. And on the show jumping day, the next day, there were only 38 horses competed. When I went to down to the start of the first roads and tracks in the 3-day event, they come up to me and said, "Look, Bill's had a fall and he's been carted off to hospital. So you've just got to get around."
Neale did well, Laurie did well, and Bill had a fall at the pipes. They were big concrete pipes that you approach looking through them. A lot of horses hung a leg there. His horse hung a leg, flipped over, fell on top of him. Horse galloped off. Someone brought it back, bunked him back on. He was away with the pixies. How he ever found those last few fences, no one knows. He was helicoptered off, and Sabre, unfortunately, he broke down, and hopelessly. So he was out, all intents and purposes. Bill's out, he's in hospital.
The next morning before the show jumping, we got him out of hospital. He was very glassy-eyed. And walking the show jumping course the next day, I kept saying to Bill, "Now this is where we've got to go, and there's a turning peg here. We've got to turn around the flag here." And we went right through it. The finish, I said, "Now, do you just go through the course with us?" And he went through the course, and he was quite okay. And he finished up jumping a clean round in the show jumping.
There's a great cartoon of him with his boots and everything under his arm and his undies, running out of the hospital, and the nurse going, "Mamma mia, mamma mia." They threw him on the horse the next day. They were all worried that because he was still pretty concussed, that he'd go the wrong way. Jumped a clear round with one arm. They win the gold medal, and Laurie gets double gold and Neale was silver.
Moments that you will never forget was when you're standing on the dais and you see the Australian flag going up and they're playing the Australian anthem. That was unbelievable.
The Australian riders had conquered the world, inspiring the generations of riders who were to follow. Much more success was in store, but that is for the next part of our story.
And I must say, I'm terribly proud of the way it's all gone. It's a wonderful sport. And it's made my life, to be quite honest.